And this is something that everybody could stand to understand, including some people on the left that are more new to the process. Like with Bernie Sanders and with what's happening, at least in center left politics to a degree, is you're trying to break essentially a 40-year cycle. I mean, a thing that was created and generated before many of us were born, of a complete neoliberalization of politics. And now what that means functionally was like in the 70s, there was a consensus that existed post New Deal and certainly in Europe through, say, the early 70s. And that consensus was essentially that there's going to be a market, shareholders are going to get delivered for, money and resources and goods are going to be created, and those benefits are going to be broadly socially distributed. Now, again, there's obvious massive racial and gender inequities in that. Although we should also acknowledge, though, that even historically, a place like New York City, the conversation on Tuesday, I mean, New York, in spite of, I mean, talk about, redlining and police brutality and race. I mean, those are the story, and Robert Moses and public housing. I mean, that's the story of New York City. But massive investments in CUNY, library, I mean, that helped everybody, right? And Richard Nixon comes in the tail end of the consensus. Nixon himself, he said, we're all Keynesians now. And so that's how you get. And the political strategy, even though Nixon himself obviously was a war criminal and a personal, a bigot. But what, they had in mind, even they had in mind, and Kevin Phillips, who developed the strategy, was that it was a coalition of the South that could deal with. They didn't actually. They had already migrated to law and order, subtextual and not so subtextual racism, and even though Nixon did support affirmative action, but like, we're not going to return to segregation, but that's it. Like, that the kind of false everybody's equal now narrative, and now we just got to do that. So he was operating in a context which facilitated the support for EPA, his own universal health care proposal, and everything else. The backlash began in the 70s with stagflation and also a retrenchment of the corporate sector, saying basically like, we don't want to share as many goods, period. And there was a whole far-right infrastructure that grew out of that. Everything from, you go to Alan Greenspan ran the Fed, and he read Ayn Rand and liked her as an adult, okay? Like, if you're a teenager and you have a moderately adjusted social life and you read Ayn Rand, you're like, what the fuck is the matter with this woman, okay? Let alone being an adult. So, and we've been through this on the show. It started with Carter. Carter, who was, turned into this very heroic figure in some ways. But he was obsessed with deficit spending. He deregulated the trucking industry, deregulated airlines. The reason Ted Kennedy challenged him in 1980 partially was because Carter wouldn't get behind a push for universal health care. And then by the time we get to the 80s, Reagan and Thatcher reset the whole template. Then the Soviet Union collapses, and then the notion is that because the Soviet Union was obviously this dictatorial, bureaucratic monstrosity, that discredits every form of nationalization. The market reigns supreme. Francis Fukuyama publishes a book called The End of History, which literally argues that, yes, we're going to have problems that arise from terrorism or the environment, but all of the big questions have been settled. And the answer is liberal capitalist democracy, period. And Clinton and Blair rise to power basically just saying, we're just going to soften the edges on it. And not only just soften the edges, that we're going to basically say, the new answer of social policy is training and education to equip you to get wealthy in the new economy, which is a fundamentally different proposition than we're going to create a baseline as a society that everybody deserves to have. That there are innate goods, healthcare, housing, and so on. This was the policy of, we'll train you and educate you to try to keep up with this bubble. And of course, in the 90s, there was a bubble. So it made, that was a politically winning formula. A lot of people were making a lot of money. The tech bubble was in full swing. Wall Street was humming. It was a good strategy, totally not durable. And even then, massively benefiting the top and growing serious income inequality. And then, we went through Bush and, again, Democrats have been fundamentally, even when they've been liberal too, they've not kind of been confronting the structural issues of the day. And we saw how deep this neoliberalization went, obviously, after Wall Street melted down the global economy, canceled a massive amount of global wealth. And, Barack Obama, I think, does deserve some credit for moving the ball on some very important issues. And I think, it's better to have halted and stopped the bleeding of a catastrophic financial crisis than not have. But the strategy that him and Geithner and Holder and everybody else, bailed out Wall Street, no criminal prosecution, no serious strategy on housing. And here we are. And that's because the money and the intellectual frameworks of neoliberalism have defined who we are for decades and decades and decades. And that's, also why some people coming into the process now, and they just can't believe that Bernie didn't just take it and, everything should just happen like this. You're riding out a historical cycle and a contested historical cycle, because we either will break out of where we're at, or they will be a late stage authoritarian capitalist consolidation of resources and a fusion of discipline of populations and mass income inequality that will be genuinely dystopic, and already in many ways is. Now, I did find this interesting. Noam Chomsky was speaking on BBC Newsnight with Evan Davis on May 10th. They're talking about Jeremy Corbyn. This is apparently before the manifesto, the Labour Party manifesto, was released. The manifesto has been very popular, getting very good reviews in the UK. But as I say, the poll numbers are very bad for Labour. The closest poll number is Conservatives at 49%, Labour at 34%. And I'll talk about that in a second. Chomsky says he'd vote for Labour, and then actually puts himself on the side of Bernie would have won the primary without thumb on the scale. But I think he does it in an interesting way. Let's take a look.
About the British election, Jeremy Corbyn has been leading the Labour Party. They have an uphill task, according to the opinion polls. Have you any advice, any thoughts about how Labour refines its pitch and makes it to government in the UK?
They should ask me to vote. I would vote for him. I mean, they have a problem. I think he's a very decent, good person. I've followed his career for some years. He's not, evidently not inspiring the population. How Labour could, Labour has not come out with its program, so we don't really know what it'll be.
But there's a sense of a lack of clarity about quite what he stands for.
That's right.
Which is odd, because he was someone who was more clear about what he stood for decades.
What's happened to the Labour Party over the last, through the neoliberal years, it became, as many call it, Thatcher light, especially under Blair. It did not represent the working class.
Does it not have to split after the election? On your analysis, it's two parties, a neoliberal-light party, a Thatcher-like party, and a Corbyn party. They're not the same party.
No, they're not. And the Labour, and in fact, it's split between the constituency and the parliamentary party. So the Labour Party has internal problems that it has to deal with. But it also has the problem of demonstrating to the electorate that it does represent their interests. The Democrats in the United States have the same problem. So, for example, if it hadn't been for the shenanigans of the party managers, the Obama-Clinton party managers, Sanders probably would have won the nomination and might very well have won the election.
I want to finish by...
These are internal problems to these decaying centrist institutions. And the anger that you talked about at first is a reflection of that.
Yeah, I disagree. The only thing I do maintain, I think that if Bernie had gotten in earlier, I agree with Sam on this, he would have done, he might have taken it. And I think, I want to make a distinction though. There's thumbs on the scale in the sense of conspiracy theories that have never had any validity, and I doubt Noam Chomsky would ever buy into, about, rigged voting and all the rest of it in terms of systemic voter fraud in places like California, which I just don't buy. And then even when you look at the DNC emails, all you just see is just kind of what you'd expect, just kind of mediocre operatives who prefer Hillary. But I do think that if there was a broader and more open intellectual culture inside the Democratic Party, you wouldn't have this buy-in out of the gate that, of course, Bernie Sanders is an intrinsically ridiculous figure. And that does, as a matter of culture, quote-unquote, rig things. And that is a big problem.
Right. Part of the reason Bernie needed to get in earlier is to fight the inertia of the party.
Right.
Like if they were ever going to change it, especially when he's not like officially a Democrat. Obama didn't need as much time as that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. I think you made the point that.
Yeah, and by the way, I think there's no doubt that Bernie Sanders would have won the general election, and that's important not as a score settling thing, but it's important as a compass forward. Now, in the UK, I always say this. I think Jeremy Corbyn's problems and his numbers are improving a bit, but he's an unpopular leader. Now, partially there's a right-wing, like, mafia media in the UK that, is almost worse than ours. And they've been unrelenting against Jeremy Corbyn. But Jeremy Corbyn also has misspoke at times. He's not a strong performer in Commons. And I also think that he, there are aspects of the British left that are pretty much, they don't exist here. And some people find, comments he's made about Hezbollah or whatever troubling. Again, I would say the distinction, I wish more politicians here could say, obviously we need to negotiate with groups like Hamas or Hezbollah. Of course. I think for some people, having a mainline party leader that almost would seem to intimate, like, well, maybe I like these groups, probably bothered people. I'm not saying that's what he said, but I'm saying that if we're just doing a realistic audit here, he got close enough to get himself in trouble. And, if you wanted to run a for real left campaign and take a centrist bureaucratic party in that direction in the UK, you needed to be seriously on target. And I don't think they have been, but they released a great manifesto. And I also think the other strategy that they really need to pursue is they just need to, and they've started it, they need to just constantly say that Theresa May and Donald Trump are, one of the same. I think that that's the best strategy they could pursue.
Yeah, it's good. And just to go back to the Bernie thing, I think Bernie supporters, especially the Bernie would have won crowd and the Bernie or busters on the farther end, would get frustrated with Hillary supporters focusing on what was external to their campaign.
Right.
And you have to do that you can't likewise do that with Bernie and say Bernie was upended by all these external factors and not also focus on what he could have done better in the future.
Right. I agree completely.
Hey, Sam Seder here. Folks, you probably heard about the whole YouTube advertiser apocalypse. Well, we're suffering from it too. We need your help. If you want to keep this show alive, you want us to be able to still put out clips on a regular basis, head over to our Patreon page. Here's the link right here or down below there. And just give us a couple bucks a month and support this program. Really appreciate it.